The Navajo Nation sits atop one of the richest uranium deposits in North America, and between 1944 and 1986, nearly 30 million tons of its ore were carried away to arm the American nuclear arsenal. The Atomic Energy Commission, the agency that built the bombs, was for years the only legal buyer, and the men who did the digging were Navajo, working small unventilated mines for wages they could reach on foot. They were not told that the air underground was thick with radon, the radioactive gas whose decay products cause lung cancer, a danger the European mining record had documented for half a century. The American government had reason to know it, and in the early 1950s, it sent the Public Health Service to study the Navajo miners' lungs while telling them nothing. Today, 523 abandoned uranium mines remain on Navajo land, and the families are still filing for compensation. The land where this began is high and dry and folded into mesas, a country of red rock and juniper, and long sight lines spread across the place where Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah meet. The Navajo Nation covers more than 27,000 square miles of it, a territory larger than 10 of the 50 states, ringed and crossed by the Chusca, the Carrizo, and the Lukachukai Mountains. In the years before the prospectors came, the economy of that country was built on livestock. Families measured their standing in sheep and goats and horses, and among the Diné, as the Navajo call themselves, the herds belonged largely to the women, passed from mother to daughter across generations. A family's wealth walked on four legs across the grazing land, moving with the seasons between the lowlands and the high pastures, and the work of tending it shaped the rhythm of the year. That economy did not fail on its own. In the 1930s, the federal government determined that the Navajo were overgrazing the reservation, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, under its Commissioner John Collier, ordered the herds reduced. Federal agents moved across the land, buying livestock, shipping it to market, and in many cases shooting the animals where they stood and leaving them in the grazing fields. The Navajo would remember it as the second long walk, a phrase that reached back to the forced removal of their grandparents, and the comparison was not loose. The slaughter hollowed out a self-sufficient pastoral economy in less than a decade. Women who had owned their family's wealth and livestock watched it carried off or killed. Men who could no longer live by the herds went looking for wages, and the wages were far away, on the railroads, in the farm fields of California and around Phoenix, work that took a man off the reservation for months at a time, and some of the men who left for it never came back. In a single generation, Navajo women went from holding their family's wealth in their own herds to depending on the wages their husbands and sons could carry home. The reduction did not only kill animals, it rearranged who in a family held the means to live, and it left families poorer and more dependent on whatever work the next decade might bring. Then, in the 1940s, the prospectors arrived, and for the first time, the work came to them. Uranium had been found in the Carrizo Mountains near the small community of Cove, in the northeastern corner of Arizona, and in the canyons around Monument Valley to the north. Mining near Cove began in 1948 and would peak in the mid-1950s. For Navajo men who had spent years leaving home to find a paycheck, the mines offered something the railroads never had. They were close. A man could walk from his hogan to the mine entrance in the morning and home again at night. The operations ranged from small holes, dug into the side of a mesa with a pickaxe and a wheelbarrow, to larger commercial works with heavy equipment, and the companies hired Navajo laborers as blasters, as timbermen setting the wooden supports, as the muckers who shoveled out the blasted rock, and as the haulers who carried the ore into the light. Pay stubs kept by one miner from 1949 show an hourly wage of between 81 cents and $1 minimum wage, and often less, for work the foremen, who were usually white, did not stay underground to share. For many of the men, it was the first wage they had ever earned. The ore they dug did not stay in the canyons. It was loaded onto trucks and hauled to mills miles away, crushed and treated with chemicals to leach out the uranium, and from there it moved on toward the weapons plants. But the work itself stayed close, and that was its appeal. To those who took it, the work was relief and good fortune both. The former miner, George Tutt, would put it plainly. Looking back across the decades, we thought we were very fortunate, but we were not told later on this will affect you in this way. What he and the others were not told had no name they could have recognized. There was no word in the Navajo language for radioactivity, no term for the invisible decay of an element, nothing in the vocabulary of a herding people to describe a gas that could not be seen or smelled and that settled into the lungs of the men who breathed it. The danger entered their lives without a name, and for years it did its work without one. The men had no reason to distrust the work. Mining was hard and dirty, but hardship was familiar, and a paycheck within walking distance of home was, after the lean years of the reduction, close to a gift. The companies offered no warnings. They posted no notices at the mine mouths, handed out no respirators, and said nothing of the air. The men, having neither a word for the hazard nor a warning of it, had no reason to read danger into a dark hole in the side of a mesa. Nothing about it announced what it was. The scale of what came out of that ground is best read in figures. The Navajo Nation spans more than 27,000 square miles across 3 states. Between 1944 and 1986, nearly 30 million tons of uranium ore were extracted from it. Somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Navajo men worked the mines across those 4 decades. The Kerr-McGee Corporation, the most prominent of the companies, removed more than 7 million tons of ore from the land in and around the reservation by itself. And when the last mine finally closed, 523 of the shafts and pits the boom had opened stood abandoned where they were, unsealed and unmarked, scattered across dozens of communities on the reservation. The federal government that had counted the Navajo's sheep and judged them too many now turned to count their canyons and found them rich. The same authority that had emptied the corrals in the name of conservation arrived a few years later to open the mines in the name of national security. The men who climbed down into those mines believed they were doing ordinary, honorable work for a fair, if modest wage, close enough to home that they could sleep under their own roofs. They were doing something else as well, though no one had explained it to them. They were supplying the raw material for the most powerful weapons ever built to a single customer that needed every ton they could dig. To understand how the ore left their canyons and who had decided it should, the story has to follow the buyer. The ore the men dug had exactly one place it could legally go. From the beginning of the federal program in 1947 through the end of 1966, the Atomic Energy Commission was the only buyer permitted to purchase uranium in the United States. There was no open market, no competing customer, no private demand. There was the commission, and the commission existed to make weapons. President Truman, who oversaw it, would put the policy plainly in those years. With international control of the atom out of reach, we must be the strongest in atomic weapons. The uranium dug out of the Navajo canyons was the first link in that chain. To get the ore out of the ground, the commission did not dig it. It paid others to. In April of 1948, the Atomic Energy Commission published a schedule of guaranteed minimum prices for domestic uranium ore and attached to it a bonus of $10,000 for the discovery of a significant new deposit payable on delivery. The commission built roads into the canyon country, published the geology, and set up ore buying stations across the Colorado Plateau, with mills at places like Monticello, Utah, and Shiprock, New Mexico, to crush the rock and concentrate the uranium for sale. The design was described, then and since, as a free enterprise program. The government would not own the mines or operate them. Private companies would hold the leases, hire the labor, and sell their concentrate to the commission at a price the commission had fixed in advance. It was a free market with a single buyer, and that buyer was the agency building the bomb. A producer on the Colorado Plateau could prospect freely, dig freely, and sell to no one but the federal government, at a price the federal government had already set. The arrangement created a boom. Thousands of prospectors poured into the Four Corners through the early 1950s, crossing the plateau with Army surplus Geiger counters and secondhand Jeeps, staking claims and chasing the bonus and the fixed price. On the Navajo Nation, the companies that mattered moved in behind them. The commission decided when the boom would end as surely as it had decided when it would begin. The incentive prices were set to run only through the spring of 1962. As that date neared, the commission announced that it would guarantee a market for domestic concentrate for a few years longer, through the end of 1966, and then no longer. The government had opened the market on a schedule, and it closed it on one as well, when its stockpiles were full and the weapons were built. The first of them had arrived even before the commission existed. During the Second World War, the Manhattan Project had quietly drawn uranium from the tailings of vanadium operations in the Canyon Country because the carnotite ore of the Colorado Plateau carried both metals at once. In 1942, the Vanadium Corporation of America leased the ground that would become the Monument Number 2 mine in Monument Valley from the Navajo Tribal Council. Vanadium came out during the war, uranium became the prize after it. That early wartime extraction is why the long accounting of Navajo uranium begins in 1944, the year before the war ended and the first bomb was tested at Trinity. After the war, the larger operators came. The Kira-McGee Corporation, an Oklahoma oil and gas company expanding into uranium, took up mines in the Cove and Lukachukai area, in Tiknospos and Coyote Canyon, and built and ran the uranium mill at Shiprock. An Associated Press photograph from May 7, 1953, shows Navajo miners at work at the Kerr-McGee mine at Cove, deep in the rock, far from any newspaper that might have run the picture with a question attached. By the time it was finished, Kerr-McGee alone had taken more than 7 million tons of ore out of the land on and around the reservation. Union Carbide and others worked the plateau alongside it. The companies held the leases and signed the paychecks, but the market they sold into and the ground they worked both belonged in the end to the government. That was the part least visible from inside the mines. The leases were approved by the Navajo Tribal Council, but the council was not a free agent. It had been organized under rules written in Washington, and its authority flowed from the federal government rather than from the Navajo people. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, inside the Department of the Interior, decided which leases the council would even consider, and the terms were negotiated and approved by the Secretary of the Interior. The council could accept a lease or reject it. It could not easily rewrite one, because any change had to go back to Washington for approval, and the Navajo Nation, hollowed out by the livestock years, needed the income. So the same federal government stood at both ends of the transaction. The Atomic Energy Commission was the only buyer the uranium could lawfully be sold to. The Department of the Interior controlled the leases under which it was dug. A private company stood in the middle, holding the lease and paying the wages, but the demand that drove the work and the ground that yielded it were both, finally, the government's to grant. The men underground saw only the company. The company was the smallest party in the room, and the money moved accordingly. The royalties the leases generated were paid into the Navajo Nation's central treasury, where they funded a tribal government that was itself working under federal oversight. The men who went down into the shafts were paid wages, the 81 cents to $1 an hour of the boom years, and not royalties. The families whose grazing land the mine sat on, who lived within sight of the mine mouths and the growing piles of waste rock, received neither. The wealth that left the canyons in the form of ore did not, for the most part, return to the canyons in the form of money. It went to the companies, to the commission, and into the weapons. The contracts that governed all of this were precise about what mattered to the buyer. They specified the grade of the ore, the price per pound of uranium oxide, the schedule of delivery, the bonus for new discovery. They were silent on the one subject that would later define the entire history. Nowhere in the guaranteed price circulars, the lease terms, or the purchase contracts was there any provision for the air the men would breathe in the mines, or any requirement that the mines be ventilated, or any acknowledgement that the work might be dangerous at all. The program was built to move ore out of the ground as quickly as the ground would give it up. The health of the people moving it was not a term of the agreement. It would be easy to read that silence as ignorance, to assume that no one yet understood what an unventilated uranium mine did to the men inside it. But that assumption would be wrong. The danger was not unknown in 1948. It had been documented in Europe for half a century, studied in the medical literature, and discussed within the American government's own agencies. The decision to leave it out of the contracts was not the absence of knowledge. To see that clearly, the story has to turn from the men who bought the ore to the science they already had in hand. The knowledge did not begin in America, and it did not begin with the bomb. It began in two mountain mining towns on opposite sides of the Urs Range in Central Europe, where men had gone underground for silver, cobalt, and uranium dyes for more than 4 centuries. In Schneeberg, in Saxony, and in Joachimsthal, in Bohemia, the miners died young, and they died of the same thing, a wasting sickness of the lungs the local people called Bergkrankheit, the mountain disease. In 1879, two German physicians, Friedrich Harting and Walter Hesse, examined the dead and identified the mountain disease for what it was. It was lung cancer. They reported that roughly 3/4 of all deaths among the Schneeberg miners were caused by it. That was the year 1879, 69 years before the Atomic Energy Commission published its first price for Navajo ore. In the decades that followed, the European record only deepened. By the 1930s, after radioactivity had been discovered and then found in the air of both the Schneeberg and the Joachimsthal mines, investigators began to name the likely cause. In 1932, two researchers studying the Joachimsthal cancers concluded that radioactivity was the most probable culprit, on the simple logic that the miners alone, among everyone in those towns, breathed it underground for years, and the miners alone got the cancer. The association between uranium mining and lung cancer was, by the late 1930s, no longer in scientific doubt. What remained in dispute was only the precise mechanism. These were deaths in an age before cigarettes were common, in men who shared the town's air and water with everyone around them and differed from their neighbors in one respect only. They went down into the mines. The cancer followed the mine, not the habits of the men. The mechanism was radon. Radon is a radioactive gas produced naturally by the decay of the radium and uranium in the rock, the same uranium the men were there to dig. It seeps out of the stone into the air of a mine, and because it is a gas, it is breathed. As it decays further, it produces a chain of solid radioactive particles, the radon progeny, and those particles, inhaled, lodge in the soft tissue of the lungs and stay there, firing off alpha radiation into the surrounding cells. In 1951, two American scientists working out the physics established that it was not the radon gas itself that did the damage, but the alpha particles thrown off by its decay products inside the lung. Their analysis explained precisely how a mine could kill a man 20 years after he left it. It was a government document, and it remained an internal one, unpublished in the open medical literature for nearly 3 decades. The American government did not need to wait for that paper to know the danger. It had been spelled out plainly inside its own files years before the boom. In 1942, the American pathologist Wilhelm Huper published a review of occupational cancers that worked methodically through every possible explanation for the Schneeberg and Joachimsthal deaths and eliminated all of them but radioactivity. The book sat on the shelf. 6 years before the commission opened the buying stations, the men who designed the uranium program were not working in the dark. They had the European record, a century old. They had the medical literature. They had, soon enough, their own measurements, taken by public health service crews sent into the Colorado Plateau mines at the start of the 1950s. They also had the remedy, and they knew it worked. The fix for a radioactive mine was not exotic. It was AIR. Radon and its progeny accumulate only where the air is still. Move enough fresh air through a mine and the concentration falls. This had been demonstrated in Europe before the war. In 1930, a ventilation project in the Joachimsthal mines cut radon levels from as high as nearly 9,000 picocuries per liter of air to below 350. And it had been demonstrated in America by the government's own hygienist. In 1950, Duncan Holliday, an industrial hygienist with the Public Health Service, wrote to an official of the Vanadium Corporation of America describing how ventilation in one mine had reduced radon exposure by a factor of 500 from nearly 27,000 picocuries per liter down to about 500. A fan and a length of air pipe could do it. The cost was small. The benefit was a man's life. Holliday became the most forceful advocate within the government for requiring that ventilation. He gathered the measurements, he carried the data into meetings, and he argued year after year that the mines could be made survivable and that the means to do it were cheap and proven. He achieved very little. The reason was not that anyone disproved him, it was that no one with the power to act would claim the job. The Atomic Energy Commission bought the ore but took the position that it did not run the mines and therefore had no authority over conditions inside them. The Public Health Service could measure radon and recommend limits, but it could not compel a single company to install a single fan. Mine safety, under American law, was left to the states, and the states did almost nothing. New Mexico began enforcing a standard only in 1958. Colorado and Utah did not take it seriously until the 1960s. Arizona, where the Cove mines were, did, in Holliday's own later words, nothing outside of take air samples. So the danger was documented, the cause was understood, the cure was known and cheap, and the responsibility belonged to no one. Holliday and his colleagues proposed a safe threshold of 1 working level, the unit physicists used for the radioactive particles in mine air, equal in a poorly ventilated mine, to about 100 picocuries of radon per liter. The states drifted toward that guideline only in the 1960s. A binding federal standard, set at 3/10 of a working level, was not adopted until 1969, and its enforcement did not take effect until the 1st of January, 1971, more than 20 years after the American program began, and 92 years after Harting and Hesse first put a name to the mountain disease. The figures mark the distance between what was known and what was done. The lung disease of the Erz Mountains was identified as cancer in 1879, when it accounted for 3/4 of all miner deaths. Radioactivity was named the probable cause by 1932. A pathologist eliminated every other explanation in 1942, 6 years before the Commission's first ore buying station opened. Ventilation had been shown to cut radon by a factor of 500 by 1950. And yet, when Bureau of Mines inspectors finally surveyed the country's uranium mines in 1967, most still exceeded 12 working level months of exposure, many of them by a wide margin. Throughout, the Navajo made up roughly a third of the men working the Colorado Plateau, breathing the air no one had been required to clean. A government capable of designing a nuclear weapon, of measuring radon in a mine to the picocurie, and of tracking the health of the men who breathed it was not capable, for more than 2 decades, of requiring a fan. The knowledge existed, the warning did not. And in those same years, instead of telling the Navajo miners what the AIR was doing to them, the government did something else with that knowledge. It studied them. In 1950, doctors began arriving in the mining country. They came from the United States Public Health Service, and they set up their examinations near the mines, in clinics and field stations across the Colorado Plateau. They listened to the men's chests, took samples of blood and sputum, asked how long each man had worked underground and in which mines, wrote the answers down, and then, the following year, came back and did it again. To the Navajo miners, this looked like something they had almost never been offered. It looked like care. A doctor had come to the canyon country, free of charge, to attend to the health of men who lived a long way from any hospital. Many of them spoke only Navajo. None of them was told what the examinations were for. What the examinations were, on paper, was a scientific study. The Public Health Service had begun a prospective epidemiological investigation of the uranium miners of the Colorado Plateau, White and Navajo, designed to measure how much radon the men were breathing and to track, year by year, which of them developed lung cancer and which of them died. Duncan Holliday handled the exposures, sending crews into the mines to sample the air. A physician named Victor Archer handled the men. The study was started, in the words of the researchers themselves, on the assumption that uranium mining was dangerous, which is to say that the government did not undertake it to discover whether the mines cause cancer. It already believed they did. The purpose was to measure how much and how fast. These were the same examinations, the same rooms, that saw the same men. In the lived record, a doctor was looking after a miner. In the official record, a researcher was recording a data point in a study of a hazard the data point had never been told about. The two records never touched. Information flowed in one direction only, out of the men and into the files. A miner might be examined a dozen times across a dozen years and never be given a diagnosis he could act on, never be handed a reason to leave the work. The men gave their blood and their work histories and went back down into the mines, and the mines were not ventilated, and the radon was not reduced, and nothing the examinations revealed was carried back to the men in a form that might have led them to stop. That silence was not accidental, and it was not, in the end, even concealed. To carry out the study, the Public Health Service needed access to the miners, and access to the miners ran through the mining companies. To keep that cooperation, the researchers agreed to tell the miners only a limited amount about the study and about the hazard they were under. The reason, preserved in the later official record, was the concern that if the men were told plainly what the mines were doing to them, they would leave the work, and the study would lose the very subjects it depended on. The hidden hazard was lung cancer. The decision, made deliberately, was that the men producing the data would not be told what the data was showing. The men, for their part, were not suspicious. By the surveys of the late 1950s, around 9 in 10 of the miners in the areas the Public Health Service visited took part. They rolled up their sleeves and answered the questions because a doctor had asked, and because nothing in their experience told them a doctor was anything other than a help. As early as 1951, the Public Health Service had concluded internally that ventilating the mines was necessary because the radon would probably cause injury to the miners. The men who would be injured were sitting in the examination chairs. They were not told. It is worth saying plainly what the study was said inside. The same Public Health Service was, in those same decades, allowing syphilis to go untreated in a group of black men in Alabama in order to observe the course of the disease. The pattern was the same: a vulnerable population, an observational study, and information withheld from the people whose bodies were producing the data. What made the Navajo evidence especially stark was something the researchers came to understand only later. Lung cancer had been a rare disease among the Navajo. Tobacco, outside of ceremony, was little used on the reservation, and the cancer that scoured the lungs of heavy smokers elsewhere had scarcely appeared among the DNA before the mines. That made the arithmetic, when it came, almost impossible to argue with. In a survey of Navajo men diagnosed with lung cancer between 1969 and 1982, 72% had worked in the uranium mines. The estimated risk of lung cancer for a Navajo miner ran at least 14 times that of a man who had not mined. In a population that barely smoked, the men who went underground were dying of a smoker's disease, and the only thing they had breathed that others had not was the air of the mines. Among one group of Navajo miners later hospitalized with lung cancer, the average man had accumulated more than 1,100 working level months of radon exposure, better than 250 times the dose the industry would, years afterward, be permitted to give a worker in a single year. The proof accumulated in the bodies of the men the study was watching. In the middle of the 1950s, the lung cancer cases among the cohort could be counted on one hand. By the middle of the 1960s, there were many times that number, and the trend line pointed only one way. Archer and his colleagues published their findings. By 1965, the statistical case linking uranium mining to lung cancer was, in the medical literature, beyond dispute. But the data that proved the danger and the deaths that had been allowed to happen were the same data. The study succeeded because the men were never warned. Its conclusions were written in the only ink available, which was their illness. Decades later, In 1995, a presidential commission set up to examine the government's Cold War radiation research turned its attention to the uranium miners. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments reviewed dozens of cases in which Americans had been exposed to radiation by their own government, and it reached a blunt conclusion about this one. Of all the groups it had studied, the committee found the uranium miners were the single group that had been put most seriously at risk of harm. The government, it wrote, had studied the men without disclosing the purpose of the examinations or warning them of the danger, and the failure to warn men who were being continually studied was, in the committee's own words, difficult to comprehend. The study followed the miners down into the mines and back out again, year after year, for as long as they lived. But the danger had never confined itself to the mines. The same men carried it home, on their clothes and in their hair. It was in the water their families drank and the rock their houses were built from. While the researchers were measuring the air underground, the contamination was already moving through the kitchens and the wells and the children of the canyon country. The mines were only where it started. The ore did not stay in the mines because the men did not stay in the mines and because the rock itself was useful. A miner came home at the end of a shift with the dust of the day in his hair and on his clothes and on his skin, and he sat down to supper with his wife and his children in a one-room house, and the dust came with him. That was the smallest part of it. The larger part was that the waste rock from the mines and the sandy tailings left behind by the mills were, to a family with little money in a country with little timber, simply building material. It was free, it was local, and it was lying in heaps a short walk from the door. Across the reservation, Navajo families used chunks of uranium ore and mill tailings to build the foundations, the floors, the walls, and the fireplaces of their homes. They mixed the tailings into the cement of cinder block. They lived inside the result for decades, not knowing that the houses were radioactive, because no one had told them the rock was anything other than rock. And what was not built into the houses lay in the open around them, in piles of waste rock and tailings that dried in the wind and blew as fine radioactive dust across the yards and into the lungs of whoever stood downwind. The cost of that was measured only much later, and the measurements were extraordinary. When the Environmental Protection Agency finally surveyed the homes, it found uranium in the household dust of 85% of the houses it sampled. In one traditional home in Monument Valley, where a woman had raised two of her sons, the radiation inside was found to be up to 100 times the level considered acceptable. The family had not built a shrine to the bomb. They had built a house out of the only stone available, and the house had been quietly irradiating them the whole time they lived in it. The clearest picture of what that meant for a single family comes from the foot of Oljato Mesa in Monument Valley, where a long gray streak across the rock marks the entrances of the Skyline Mine. Below it, on the valley floor, the Begay family made their home. Elsie Mae Begay and her aunt, Mary Holliday, raised 9 children between them in the shadow of that mesa and the piles of mill tailings and mine debris that the company left behind became, for the children, a place to play. They dug caves in the tailings. They slid down the waste piles the way other children slid down sand dunes. Elsie Mae Begay washed the family's clothing by hand, the clothing that carried the uranium dust home from the workings. In the years that followed, she lost one son to a brain tumor at the age of 24 and another to lung cancer at the age of 40. She herself underwent surgery for thyroid cancer. Asked whether the uranium had caused it, she would not claim more than the evidence allowed. "They never can tell me," she said. And then, after a pause, "It might have been." She did not keep the question to herself. Begay carried her family's story to college campuses and to Congress, and a documentary film about the mine below her home helped turn a private tragedy into a matter of public record. The begays were not unusual. A few miles away, on the west side of Cane Valley, a uranium mill operated from 1955 until 1968 on land leased from the Navajo Nation, crushing the local ore and leaving behind the sandy radioactive tailings that gave the children their caves and their slides. Open mines like the John M. Yazzie Number 1 stood in the same valley. More than 60 abandoned mines would eventually be counted in the Monument Valley area alone, and the mill tailings would not begin to be hauled away and sealed until the 1990s under a federal cleanup law that Congress did not pass until 1978. In a desert, the cruelest theft is water, and the contamination took that too. The Four Corners is dry country, and water is scarce and precious and not lightly wasted. When the companies left and the open pit mines filled with rain, the pools that gathered in them were, to a herding family miles from any tap, a gift. People drank from them. They watered their sheep and their horses at them. They drank as well from springs and shallow wells in ground laced with the same uranium the men had been digging, and from water that ran straight out of the mines themselves. Decades afterward, when federal agencies sampled 250 unregulated water sources across the reservation, 28 of them exceeded the safe limits for uranium or other radioactive elements. Wells were capped. Clean water was trucked into families who had been drinking from the mines for 30 years. It fell hardest on the people who had never gone underground. The miners at least knew they worked in the mines, even if they did not know what the mines were doing to them. Their wives and their children knew only their homes, the floors and the walls, the dust on the laundry, the water in the bucket they cooked with and bathed the children in, the tailings pile at the edge of the yard. The exposure that the men received in shifts, the families received around the clock for years in the one place a person is supposed to be safe. The danger had started as an occupational hazard for a few thousand men. It became an environmental condition for everyone who lived near a mine, a mill, or a waste pile, which on the Navajo Nation was a great many people. The figures of the contamination, gathered long after the fact, describe its reach. 523 abandoned uranium mines were left across the reservation, scattered through more than 27,000 square miles. To find them all, the Environmental Protection Agency spent some $12 million and flew aerial radiation surveys over more than 1,400 square miles of land. Of 250 water sources tested, 28 came back over the limit. Of the homes sampled, 85% held uranium in their dust. The agency estimated that demolishing a single contaminated house, hauling away the debris, and rebuilding it would cost $250,000, and it counted hundreds of structures that might need exactly that. And across those same decades, the cancer rate among the Navajo, which had once run well below the rate for the United States as a whole, doubled between the 1970s and the 1990s, even as the national rate edged downward. Researchers have stopped short of declaring a single cause. They have also said that the mining byproducts in the soil, the air, and the water almost certainly played a part. This was the slow disaster, the one that arrived a grain at a time, a house built one summer, a well dug the next, a childhood spent on a tailings pile, a cancer 2 decades on. It was so gradual that it could be mistaken by anyone not living inside it for no disaster at all. But the contamination did not only come slowly. On a July morning in 1979, near a place called Church Rock, New Mexico, it came all at once in a single flood, and the country that had paid almost no attention to the slow poisoning of the Navajo paid very little attention to that either. In the early summer of 1979, a Navajo man named Larry King, who worked as an underground surveyor at the United Nuclear Corporation's uranium operation at Church Rock, New Mexico, noticed something wrong with a dam. The dam was an earthen wall built to hold back the liquid and sludge waste from the mill that turned raw ore into yellow cake. On the south face of it, cracks had opened, cracks wide enough, he later said, to put his feet into. King did what a surveyor does. He measured them, he reported them to his supervisors, and the work went on. The cracks were one more thing noted and filed in a long history of things noted and filed and not acted upon. 2 weeks later, before dawn on the 16th of July, 1979, the dam failed. At about 5:30 in the morning, a breach some 20 feet across opened in the south cell of the tailings pond, and the waste behind it came out all at once. 1,100 tons of solid radioactive mill waste and roughly 94 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings solution poured down Pipeline Arroyo and into the Puerco River. The waste carried not only uranium, but the more dangerous decay products that come with it, thorium and radium among them, and the liquid was acid enough to burn skin and, in places, to twist a metal culvert where it ran. Residents along the river woke to the sound of water roaring in a riverbed where there had been no rain, and to an odor they would not forget, and to a current that ran an unnatural yellow. It was the largest accidental release of radioactive material in the history of the United States. By the measure of the radioactivity it put into the environment, it was larger than the accident at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, which had occurred less than 4 months earlier. That accident, the entire country had watched in fear. Some 140,000 people had left their homes around the Pennsylvania plant. The President of the United States had come in person to walk through the control room. The most trusted news anchor in America had warned the country on the evening news that it might be facing the opening stage of a catastrophe. Church Rock released more radioactivity than that into a river that people drank from, and it broke, as it happened, 34 years to the day after the first atomic bomb was tested at Trinity in the same southwestern desert. The river carried the contamination roughly 80 miles down through Navajo communities and past the city of Gallup and on into Arizona, past the homes of some 1,700 people. This was dry country, and the Puerco, such as it was a working river. People drank from it, watered their crops from it, and grazed their sheep and horses along it. The acid in the flood burned the legs and feet of livestock and of the people who waded into the wash that morning to pull their animals out of it. Sheep that drank from the river died. A doctor with the Indian Health Service in Gallup, describing the children he saw playing in the stagnant pools the flood left behind, called the water deadly poisonous. A chapter official named Robinson Kelly, who heard the river roaring before dawn and caught an odor he would call the worst he had ever known, remembered an uncle who waded into the effluent that morning to gather the family's stranded sheep and who developed sores on his feet and legs, as many who entered the water that day did. None of this was an act of God. The dam had been built on ground known to be geologically unsound, a fact understood by the company and by the agencies that were supposed to oversee it. The cracks had been seen and measured and reported by one of the company's own workers. The failure at Church Rock was not a bolt from a clear sky. It was a foreseeable consequence of a structure that had been warned about and left standing, which made it of a piece with the entire history that preceded it. The danger had been known, nothing sufficient had been done. What followed the spill was, by now, a familiar pattern. The warnings to stay out of the water did not come for days, and when they came by radio and by signs posted along the river. In a country where many people spoke only Navajo and many had no radio. They were too slow, too few, and not authoritative enough to keep families and livestock out of the wash, and people kept crossing it because they had animals on the other side. The Indian Health Service told residents not to drink the water, but the families who relied on the river were poor and had nowhere else to get it. Within about 5 weeks, United Nuclear was milling uranium at Church Rock again. And the country, which had crowded its cameras and its officials around the plant in Pennsylvania, looked away from the larger disaster in New Mexico almost entirely. There was no presidential visit to Church Rock, no anchor warning of catastrophe on the evening news, no national reckoning. Larry King, who had measured the cracks and would spend the rest of his life on the matter, put the difference plainly years afterward. 3 Mile Island had more coverage, he said, and people were compensated right away. The two accidents were separated by less than 4 months and most of a continent. The radioactivity at Church Rock was greater. The difference in how the nation responded was not a difference in the size of the release. It was a difference in where it happened and to whom. The flood receded, but the contamination did not. The mine beside the mill, the Northeast Church Rock mine, had produced some 3.5 million tons of ore between 1968 and 1982, among the largest of any mine on the Navajo Nation, and its waste remained where it had been left. In the decades that followed, the area would become one of the largest abandoned uranium mine cleanup projects in the country, and a researcher testing wells along the Puerco in 2015 would still find uranium above the federal limit for drinking water. The river that carried the flood has never been fully cleaned. By the time the dam broke at Church Rock, the era that produced it was already ending. The federal contracts had run out, the price had collapsed, the mines were closing one after another across the Colorado Plateau. The men who had walked down into them in the 1950s were in their 50s and 60s now, and they were beginning to die, in numbers, of the lung cancer the government had spent 2 decades measuring in them and had never warned them about. Out of that mortality, slowly, a fight began among the dying miners, among their widows, and among a handful of lawyers who had started to gather the evidence of what had been known and when. They wanted something that had never been offered to the men of the Canyon Country. They wanted the government to admit in writing what it had done. The first attempt to make the government answer for what it had done went through the courts, and it failed. In 1979, a former Secretary of the Interior named Stuart Udall, by then a private attorney in Phoenix, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of a group of Navajo uranium miners and the survivors of those already dead. The case was called Begay versus United States, and Udall built it on a particular argument that the special trust relationship between the United States and the Navajo Nation ought to override the legal immunity that normally shields the federal government from being sued. He was trying to find a door in a wall that was designed not to have one. The wall held. In 1984, the court ruled that the government could not be sued because it had never waived its immunity, and it cited the national security interest of the weapons program as the justification. Years later, the federal commission that reviewed the Cold War radiation studies would find that there had been no national security ground or any other sufficient to justify continuing to expose the miners to the radon. But that came too late for the lawsuit. What makes the decision remarkable is what the court conceded along the way. It found, as a matter of fact, that the Public Health Service had decided not to warn the miners in order to keep the mine owners cooperative and the study intact. It acknowledged that the men had been harmed by that silence. And the judge wrote that the situation cries for redress, that the miners deserved a remedy, before concluding that the law did not allow him to grant one. The remedy, the court said, would have to come from Congress. A federal court had looked directly at the wrong, named it, and ruled that it could do nothing about it. So the fight moved to Congress, where it took years more. There had been hearings in Grants, New Mexico as early as 1979. Miners testified, and widows, and Stuart Udall, and the scientists who had the data. From the first organized push to the final vote was some 16 years of effort by people who were, many of them, dying while they lobbied. The result was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush on the 15th of October, 1990. It was called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and it did two things the courts had refused to do. It offered money. A uranium miner who could show that he had worked in the mines and he had developed one of the covered diseases would receive a one-time payment of $100,000. And it offered, for the first time, words. Written into the statute in plain language was an apology. The Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation, it read, to the individuals described in subsection A and their families for the hardships they have endured. After 4 decades, the government had finally said, law, that it was sorry. But the apology and the money arrived wrapped in the requirements of a documentary world that the men of the Canyon Country had never lived inside, and the gap between the two records reopened at the worst possible moment. To collect, a miner or his widow had to prove things on paper. He had to prove how long he had worked underground and how much radon he had breathed, measured against a high exposure threshold the law had set. He had to prove he had a qualifying illness. And if he had died, the person claiming on his behalf had to prove she had been his lawful wife. Each of these proofs collided with the life the men had actually lived. The companies had kept poor records, and many of the men had been paid in cash. So the same government that had never required anyone to track what the mines were doing to the miners now required the miners to produce the paperwork proving it. The exposure threshold and the narrow list of covered diseases shut out many who were plainly sick. The claim also demanded certified birth, death, and medical records, decades old and scattered across distant offices, for families who had been issued few official papers to begin with. And the original law contained a requirement about smoking that fell with particular irony on the Navajo, a people whose very rarity of smoking had made them the clearest proof in all the science that it was the radon and not tobacco that was killing the miners. The cruelest barrier was the simplest. Many Navajo couples had married in the traditional way, by the agreement of families and the customs of the community, a marriage real and recognized by everyone who knew them and witnessed by no county clerk. It had produced a household and children and a shared life of 50 years. It had not produced a state marriage certificate because that was not how the marriage had been made. When the miner died of his lung cancer and his widow filed her claim, the federal form asked her to attach proof of the marriage, and she had none that the government would accept. The marriage was entirely real. The official record of it did not exist. Widows who had buried husbands killed by the mines were turned away because they could not produce a piece of paper their marriage had never generated. That the barriers were unjust is not a matter of interpretation, because Congress itself eventually conceded it. In the year 2000, the act was amended. The smoking requirement was removed, the exposure threshold was lowered, uranium millers and ore transporters, left out of the original law, were added, and most tellingly, Congress directed that the claims process for Navajo applicants be brought into conformance with Navajo law, tradition, and custom, and that claims be allowed to rest on traditional ties of family. The amendment was an admission. The apology of 1990 had been written in a language the people it apologized to could not speak, and it had taken another decade to translate it. The numbers of the program describe both its scale and its limits. Since 1990, The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act has paid out more than $2.5 billion to more than 41,000 claimants of all kinds. The award for a uranium miner has remained $100,000, a single lump sum, never once adjusted for inflation across 35 years. And for most of the program's life, one date governed everything. A man had to have worked in the mines on or before the end of 1971 to qualify at all. Every miner who went underground after that, and the mines ran until 1986, was excluded by a line drawn on a calendar. The apology was real, and so was the money, and for the families who managed to collect it, it mattered. But neither the words nor the payments did the one thing that might have undone the harm. They did not seal a single mine, or pull the ore out of a single wall, or clean a single well. 523 abandoned mines still lay open across the reservation. The land itself had never been apologized to, and it was still there, still contaminated, waiting for someone to decide whose job it was to make it safe. The job of making the land safe fell, in the end, to the same federal government that had opened it, and it has gone slowly. Since the first cleanup plan in 2008, the work has been real but partial. Assessments have been made, warning signs posted, some contaminated homes rebuilt, a handful of mines sealed. Yet the waste from the 523 abandoned mines remains, for the most part, where it has lain since 1986. What has changed most is money. The Environmental Protection Agency has reached enforcement agreements and settlements worth more than $1.7 billion with the corporate successors of the companies that did the mining, among them the heirs of Kerr-McGee and of the Vanadium Corporation of America, and those funds are now available to begin assessment and cleanup at 230 of the 523 mines. That is about 2 in 5. Nearly 300 mines still have no dedicated source of funding at all. The work that has begun has gathered, fittingly, around the places where the story started. In March of 2024, the Lukachukai Mining District in Cove, Arizona, the same cove where the digging began in 1948, became the first site on the Navajo Nation added to the federal Superfund National Priorities List, the roster of the most hazardous sites in the country. On the 5th of November, 2025, crews began hauling 13,000 cubic yards of uranium waste rock off the Mesa 5 complex in the Lukachukai Mountains above Cove into an engineered repository sealed against the rain, a $13 million job expected to take about a year. At Church Rock, the cleanup of the mine beside the spill, some 1 million cubic yards of waste, has at last been set in motion. The current president of the Navajo Nation, Bu Nygren, has said the federal government must keep at the work until all 523 abandoned uranium mines across the Navajo Nation are addressed. At the present pace, that is the labor of generations. The compensation, meanwhile, nearly died and was revived. The 1990 Act's authority to accept new claims expired, and the last claim was taken on the 10th of June, 2024. For more than a year, a law that had taken 16 years to pass simply stopped, to public outcry, while sick people waited. Then, on the 4th of July, 2025, Congress folded a revival into a larger budget bill and signed it back into force, expanded. The change the miners had wanted for 3 decades finally came. The cutoff that had excluded everyone who worked after the end of 1971 was extended to the end of 1990, at last covering the men who had dug until the mines closed in 1986. Kidney disease was added to the list of covered illnesses. The Downwinder Award was raised to match the miners' $100,000, but the new window is narrow. Claims must be filed by the end of 2027. And so in 2026, the same effort that has run through this entire history is underway once more. The Department of Justice has opened a claims portal. Across the Navajo Nation, tribal leaders have spent the year urging families to apply before the deadline closes. Many of those leaders are the children and grandchildren of the miners, the families who grew up on the tailings piles in Cove and Monument Valley and Church Rock, carrying the work their parents began. Council Delegate Amber Kinasba Crotty
has called the reauthorization a meaningful step, and then said the necessary next thing, that it is still not enough, that what is needed is a lasting extension that reflects the lived experience of Navajo families. The fight to be compensated for the harm is now, like the harm itself, being handed down a generation. The Navajo Nation had also drawn one hard line of its own. In 2005, its government banned all new uranium mining and milling anywhere on its land, deciding that whatever the ore beneath them was worth, it was not worth another generation of what the first one had cost. The mines are no longer worked, but 523 of them stand abandoned across the reservation, and homes and water sources across that land still carry elevated radiation. The risks the government measured 70 years ago are the risks that remain: lung cancer from the particles in the air, and bone cancer and kidney disease from the radionuclides in the water. The harm did not end with the miners. It passed to their wives, and to the children who played on the waste, and into the ground and the wells, where it waits. The whole of it can be set down in figures. Between 1944 and 1986, nearly 30 million tons of uranium ore were taken from Navajo land. Some 4,000 Navajo men mined it, for wages of around $1 an hour, sold for years to a single government buyer, the agency, building the bombs of the Cold War. 523 mines were left open across more than 27,000 square miles. The government apologized, in writing, on the 15th of October, 1990, and has since paid more than $2.5 billion to more than 41,000 people, while a line drawn at 1971 excluded the men who dug until 1986, until a revival in 2025 moved it. More than $1.7 billion in settlements now stands behind the cleanup of 230 of the mines. The rest wait. The last accounting is not finished, because the story is not over. In the questions this channel always asks, the answers here are unusually plain. Who decided that this land would be mined? The federal government, which was the only legal buyer of the ore and the approver of the leases. Who knew the danger? The same government, which held a century of European evidence, its own scientists' measurements, and the results of a study it ran on the miners themselves. Who profited? The companies and the weapons program they supplied. And who paid? The Navajo, the men in the mines, the families in the houses, the children on the tailings, and the land that holds the waste still. There is one record that the government did not write and cannot revise. It is the record the families have kept, the oral histories gathered at the University of New Mexico, the testimony carried to Congress, the names, the dates, and the deaths held in memory in Cove, Monument Valley, and Church Rock. The official record apologized and moved on. The community record remembers because it has to, because the contamination is still in the ground its keepers live on. Thank you for spending this time with a story that asks to be remembered rather than simply watched. The places American power chose for its hardest work were real places, with people in them before and after, and their histories are still unfolding. So please like and subscribe. We will keep telling them here, one place at a time.